Thank you very, very much for that warm introduction. Thanks to all of you. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very, very much for the invitation, for the warm welcome, for the opportunity to speak about this book that was published recently by Sheikh Rachid together with myself. I'd like to use this as an opportunity to do a few things. I'd like to introduce the book. I'd like to say what it's about, what its context is, how it relates to previous work that I wrote on modern Islamic political thought, with particular reference to Sheikh Rachid's thought. And I want to kind of open up a discussion about what some of my observations and arguments and conclusions are about the trajectory of modern Islamic political thought and its aspirations to theorize a distinct conception of legitimacy, of justice, of political order, and of democracy. What that was sort of historically before the historic revolutions of 2011, what those revolutions and the experiment with creating democracy did to parties like Ennahda in Tunisia. I want to talk a little bit about this turn from Islamic democracy to Muslim democracy, or from traditional political Islam to Muslim democracy, how I understand it, how this book contributes to that, what Dr. Galul has to say, and then hopefully this leaves a lot of time to hear some thoughts of people in the room, whether what we have to say resonates, whether it makes sense, whether it doesn't make sense, and sort of where things stand today in light of the many tragic events since at least 2013 and 14. First off, this is the book. The book consists of a relatively lengthy introduction by me, which has this theme. So, as we all know, let me begin here. In 2016, 2 years after Tunisia adopted a democratic constitution that was to a large extent co-written by the members of Ennahda that participated in the Constituent Assembly, and 5 years after the Jasmine Revolution, at the annual party Congress of 2016, the Ennahda party declared that they were no longer referring to themselves as an Islamist party or belonging to political Islam, but embracing something called Muslim democracy. And so that's kind of the opening point for this book and for the talk. And the question is, what is this idea of Muslim democracy? How does it differ from other ideas of the Islamic State or an Islamic Republic or an Islamic conception of democracy? What is the significance in saying, we are now Muslim Democrats and please understand us in this way? And so I, as an academic, have some of my own views, but the book is an attempt to articulate this. So I have an introduction, then there are 10 essays by Sheikh Rachid, translated more or less for the first time. I don't know if everybody can see here, but some of these are essays that were published before 2011. Some of them were lectures actually delivered, I believe, in Manchester or Birmingham, perhaps similar to lectures that he would have given here on questions of freedom, how committed Muslims should understand the problem of freedom. Is it an alien, liberal, Western, secular concept that has nothing to do with Islam, or is it something that has a place within an overall Islamic conception of morality, law, justice, political order, so on and so forth? A number of the essays grapple with the problem of opposing authoritarianism and to what extent Islamist parties should prioritize basic political freedoms, democracy, as opposed to a more comprehensive conception of an Islamic-based public order. What is the argument for grasping for even basic civil and political rights and freedoms in the face of authoritarianism, but how that also fits into an Islamic conception of political morality. A number of the essays deal with various currents within modern Islamic and Islamist political thought. So one of my favorite essays, Between Sayyid Qutb and Malik bin Nabi, is a very, very important essay because it really tracks multiple strands of influence on thinkers within the Tunisian Islamist movement. As we all know, some inspiration came from the traditional ideology of the Egyptian and Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, but Sheikh Rachid was also a very close student of the Algerian historian and political theorist Malik bin Nabi, who had a very different orientation. And in fact, if you read Sayyid Qutb closely, I'm not insinuating that anybody here has, you will notice that Qutb at many times refers somewhat negatively to Malik bin Nabi. Not by name. He talks about this Algerian writer talking about civilization. And so it's a very interesting, for those of you that are curious about how GHANNOUCHI'S thought travels between different sources of inspiration. It's a very, very important essay. He talks about various kinds of internal criticism of aspects of the Islamic movement and Islamist ideology in When is Islam the Solution, the problems of contemporary Islamist discourse. And then a number of essays, the last three, are particularly situated in the context of the Tunisian Constitution of 2014. So it was a constitution that was to a large extent drafted by the representatives and deputies of Ennahda, but the result was not an Islamic regime. It was not an Islamic constitution. It did not have a reference to the Islamic Sharia as a source or inspiration of law. It included various things like the universality of international human rights, certain ways of talking about gender relations. And so from an Islamic standpoint, the Constitution required commentary. What is Islamic about it? Why do we accept this from an Islamic point of view? How do we understand this in terms of our values and aims and so forth? And so those last three essays are quite important, and they really deal, I think, with a lot of subtlety as well as sophistication with this transition to a distinct conception of political action that is referred to as Muslim democracy. And then about half the book is a series of dialogues between Sheikh and myself. You see here, I was looking somewhat younger. Mu'adh remembers this. I think this was the winter of 2017 and 18, as well as 18 and 19. So this was, I have to say, if you don't mind a sort of a personal comment, this was an extraordinary privilege and pleasure and honor for me. My second book that our brother mentioned, The Caliphate of Man, was in fact inspired by my encounter with GHANNOUCHI'S book, Al-Hurriyat al-Amma fi al-Dawla al-Islamiyya, Public Freedoms in the Islamic State. I was aware of the book, of course, for many years, but I started reading it in detail shortly after the Tunisian Revolution in 2011 or 12. I was thinking I was going to write an article on GHANNOUCHI'S thought as a legal theorist. And in fact, as I started to read this book, I quickly discovered that what was central to the book and central to his thought was this concept of the universal khilafah. That the central, and he refers to this as the central concept of Islamic political philosophy, that the people or the ummah is God's caliph on earth. And it's out of this that flows all of the conception of political legitimacy, democracy, political order, public rights and freedoms, and even what it means to think about the Sharia in public in a modern state. So I was transformed by this. And I completely rewrote my entire research project. I became fascinated with this concept of the universal caliphate. I tracked it back through modern Islamic thought, beginning with figures like Maududi, but also looking at 19th century reformist thought, especially in Tunisia, figures like Khairuddin al-Tunisi and Ahmed bin Diaf and so forth. And so this ended up being my second book, and GHANNOUCHI'S thought was the culmination of this book. And in my mind, his thought through Public Freedoms in the Islamic State was the kind of culmination of a 20th century and 21st century project within the Islamic international public sphere of coming to terms with the idea of the modern state, with the idea of democracy, while remaining committed to certain concepts like divine sovereignty and the centrality of the Islamic Sharia. So for me, he was a historical thinker, and when you spend time, writing a book on many figures and spending so much time dealing with his thought, you become very attached to a thinker, and you develop lots of ideas, and you start to think with a political thinker. And so I had the initiative to translate this book into English, which we finally completed, I think, in 2021. So that book is available in English, and that was a great honor. And it was through that that you can hold it up there. I came to be acquainted with Mu'adh and Sheikh's family and himself, and so this opportunity to spend many, many days with him. He was extremely generous with his time. He spent hours upon hours in his home at a time when he was extremely busy helping Beji the Sebsi run the country, and yet he found time to devote attention to the intellectual legacy that we were both discussing. And so you'll see the way that I've edited these dialogues. They cover a number of different topics from his biography and formation. I was very interested in, how somebody from rural southern Tunisia becomes an intellectual. What were his sources of thought? Much of this is known in the public sphere, but hearing him talk about it and pressing him on certain issues was important. We talked about the themes of democracy, sovereignty, and morality. Again, the universal khilafa, democracy, and the meaning of the Sharia. And finally, freedom, pluralism, and toleration. And so there were many areas. As an academic and a political theorist, you're always interested in the problems of a particular body of thought. What are its gaps? What are its questions? What are the points that you'd like to see clarified? So it's never simply explain more, but it's do you see certain kinds of areas that are underexplicated or need to be developed? And so we spent a lot of time talking on those kinds of issues, and it was quite explicit that it was comparative. His thinking about democracy is extremely sophisticated and refers to democratic theory as developed in France and the United States and in the Soviet Union. And so he's grappling with problems that political theorists from outside the Islamic world have grappled with. And so that was a very, very great honor to, as a political philosopher myself, engage in this dialogue with him and try to see where his own thought was developing and what he thought. And I can only thank him for his generosity and his willingness to engage in this. And it's my hope not only that this is a contribution to the Islamic public sphere and understanding of his thought and understanding of thinking about Islam and democracy more generally, but also that our dialogues will become part of his canon. That people will look to this to help understand better his thinking when pressed on certain kinds of issues, and that it'll be part of sort of the modern library of his thought and Islamic political thought more generally. Now, I don't know how long you want me to speak. It's very important with academics to be very clear about this. What I usually do from here is I say, so let me, can I see that book? So this is the English translation of Public Freedoms in the Islamic State. And you see it's an enormous book. It's extremely sophisticated. It's a very dense academic tome that, perhaps Mu'adh can attest was written in many cases while in hiding. So it was supposed to be a PhD thesis, but he said that he finished it, وَأَنَا مُخْتَفِي was how he put it to me, in Algeria and perhaps back here in London. And so what I usually do is I usually say what my interpretation of this body of thought is. I'm going to try to be brief about that because nobody wants to hear an academic lecture on these sorts of things. But I think there's a few things that need to be established to understand the significance of this turn to Muslim democracy. So, as I've said, I think it'll be familiar to many people here that the core concept around which much, if not all, modern Islamic thought from the 1920s, perhaps to the present, was around the concept of sovereignty. So, of course, as we all know, you have thinkers like Maududi and others from the 1920s and 30s saying that the central feature of Islamic political thought is the idea of divine sovereignty, or hakimiyatullah. The idea that God is sovereign and that what it means to be divine, one of the attributes of Godhead is giving law. And so if you are claiming the right to give law, you are claiming certain aspects of divinity, which of course is a kind of blasphemy or kufr. So the concept of sovereignty has been central to Islamic political thought at least since the 1920s or 30s. Now, you have the question of what does it actually mean in practice for sovereignty to be executed? You may believe that God acts in the world and is causing events in the world, but most people don't believe that God is sitting behind a desk issuing judgments as a qadi, or issuing edicts as a ruler, or as a parliamentarian. So these questions about how God's sovereignty is executed. And a very interesting feature is that it's actually Maududi himself that introduces the idea of the ummah and the people as God's khalifa. This is not a later modernist liberal invention. It is something that Maududi himself puts into the intellectual bloodstream. So from the beginning of what we might call modern Islamic or Islamist political thought, you have these two concepts. God is sovereign, but the people, not the ruler, not the sultan, not the general, and not even the scholars of the ulama, has received the obligation to bring about a divine order. So from the beginning, Maududi himself, I'm sure many of you know, refers to his own ideal as a kind of theo-democracy. So this concept of sovereignty is guiding Islamist thought throughout the 20th and 21st century. I don't want to get too technical on what the concept of sovereignty is. We can maybe do that during the break. But what I want to stress here is that by the writing of Ghanouchi, particularly in this book, my claim is that Ghanouchi had developed the most comprehensive, most sophisticated theory of how a regime or a society or a state can uphold in equal measure both divine and popular sovereignty. And the theological claim is this concept of the people as God's caliph. And that's extremely important because there are many concepts that are derived from fiqh that many Sunni thinkers have tried to stretch into a concept of constitutionalism or democracy. Things like shura, things like the election of the ruler as opposed to divine designation, things like the bay'ah, things like the constitutional tradition in which the ruler has rights and responsibilities but limited authority. But these are all juridical concepts that can only go so far. By making central the theological idea that the people is God's caliph, you have a much more robust and comprehensive theory of why the people is the source of Islamic virtue, Islamic power, Islamic morality, and Islamic normativity. The second point is that while Ghanouchi was a democratic theorist, through this book, he was not a liberal theorist. He was not, in fact, the book is so fascinating, and I love teaching it to students in America because it begins with a critique of Western democracy. Like in Britain, like in France, by saying there are many mechanisms of democracy that are great, but there's no underlying foundation that guarantees that they be put to a moral purpose. And so the problem of Islamic political thought is how can you say that these mechanisms are valuable? We can have elections, freedom of the press, rule of law, freedom of assembly, separation of powers, unions, things like this. But underlying that is a deep moral foundation. So the theory is a phrase that we political philosophers like to use, perfectionist. It says that the purpose of politics is to make humans the best that they can be. And this is a direct quote from a number of his works. The purpose of politics is to create the conditions for people to live in innate accord, tawafuq fitri, with divine law. So politics is not just about peace or separation of powers or managing conflict or the IMF or Corona or anything like that. It's about making humans as good as they can be. Third, there is a robust place for the idea of divine sovereignty in the divine law. Fourth, the central assumption, here's where it differs from lots of traditional Western Republican and liberal democratic thought. The fundamental assumption of public freedoms in the Islamic State is a kind of moral unity. The assumption that the people who is ruling is a Muslim people. It's a pious people. It's a people that sees itself as God's Khalifa on earth, and so therefore agrees that political action should be harmonized in a kind of unity towards shared moral purposes. And so, yes, there's separation of powers, there's pluralism, but those are all put in the service of a kind of moral unity. And there's fascinating discussions of Western political thinkers like Montesquieu and James Madison, where he says that's good for them, because those poor modern Westerners no longer have unity about their moral purposes. But alhamdulillah, we still do, so we can assume that politics is about unity. And that's a very important shift to what happens after. Fifth, the people is the source of all political authorities. The people can create new institutions, and there's popular participation in lawmaking, including in the making of the Sharia. Now, here is Sheikh. I'm going to skip over some of these things. We all know then what happens. There are radical democratic elections in Tunisia in 2011 to the Constituent Assembly, perhaps one of the most radically democratic experiments ever. There was no Egyptian army hanging over. There was no occupying American troops. It was just the Tunisians and their own political forces. I don't need to repeat what kind of political system came out of that. Now, here's where you start to see the shift. So note these two quotes with the time that I have left. In 2012, Sheikh is still saying that the state loses its legitimacy and right to obedience to the extent that it departs from the law, that is the Sharia. 1 year later, in Islam, there is no church that can monopolize the interpretation of Islam, but this is left rather to the Ummah and the people through its institutions. And so when we discovered that the question of Sharia was raised, we found it to be a subject of ikhtilaf or disagreement. But constitutions are not adopted on the basis of what there is disagreement around, but rather what is agreed upon. And so you see this shift to saying we need to take the reality of politics seriously. So if this previous set is my characterization of Islamic democracy, on my reading, the idea of Muslim democracy is the following. One, politics is not about making us perfect, but is about a contract around mostly worldly goods, things that we all have in common in the dunya. We have to take the existing range of pluralism as a fact. There are radical secularists. There are unionists. There are nationalists. There are feminists. There are communists. There are perhaps radical Salafis. There are people that have fundamental disagreements about politics, but if you want a political order that's not based on authoritarianism or civil war, you have to deal with the actually existing range of pluralism and not your ideal range of pluralism. And so agreement and consensus is the primary task of politics. The Islamic Sharia becomes a matter of whatever prevents tyranny and limits government. And the overarching theme that is repeatedly brought up is the Wathiqat al-Medina, the Covenant of Medina, that the Prophet made an agreement with many tribes that were not Muslim, and this agreement was pluralistic, and it was about worldly goods. And if it was good enough for the Prophet, why is it not good enough for us in Tunisia today? And at one point, in one of his essays that's translated, Sheikh says, we Muslims are lucky that our first state was a pluralist state. And so there's some quotes that we can look at later. I want to conclude here, which these are some political theory questions that may not resonate with you, Perhaps you can speak back and say, what does this turn to Muslim democracy signify for you? But there's a number of ways of thinking about this from a political theory perspective, that it's an attempt to arrive at a kind of constitutional consensus that's not really based on a deep metaphysical agreement. Sheikh once said to me that we support the Constitution, but الدستور غير مقدس. The Constitution is not sacred. It could be revised. It's as good as it is as long as it works. So we could perhaps understand this as a matter of non-ideal theory. This is ideal theory, when you have the conditions that you want. This is when you have to deal with conditions that are maybe not the ones that you would prefer. Some people say that Muslim democracy should not be taken that seriously. It's just rhetoric. It's just something to tell the French, ease up, you don't need to be scared of us, let us continue to operate in politics, and to tell other Tunisian political actors, like Nidat Tunis and others that were very hostile to Ennahda, that we are signaling to you that we have adopted a different branding or ideology. We're not trying to monopolize power. But in my view, I think what's very significant historically is, as I began, the concept of sovereignty dominated Islamic political thought for most of modernity. In this Muslim democratic writings, the concept of sovereignty goes away. There isn't this obsession with saying, who is the sovereign agent? Is it God? Is it the people? And to what extent can the people speak in a unified way? Rather, it begins with a different set of realities about how politics actually operates, dealing with political evil as opposed to political ideals. And so it doesn't assume that politics flows from a single sovereign voice, even if it's the people as God's caliph. But it's not merely moderate, or it's not merely secular. It preserves the idea that politics is still about competition and conflict. It's still a space to pursue your own aims, but you pursue them democratically. You pursue them while recognizing others as legitimate actors, not to be eradicated. And so in my view, this last concept is one that I'd like to suggest, that this turn to Muslim democracy represents a historic moment in Islamic political thought, that it's post-sovereigntist and it's agonistic. It sees politics not as a space where everything flows from morality, but things flow from a kind of political struggle contained by democratic recognition. Now, people can tell me why I got it all wrong.